When you start writing your story, do you start with a plot? Do you start with characters? Do you start with a setting? Or do you start with something else? In this episode of the How to Be an Author podcast, I'm going to be talking about maybe a surprising way that I can think of to start writing your story. It's something that too many writers forget to think about. And then when it becomes crucial for them to know this thing, they have to go back and spend a lot of time making sure that everything is correct. I'm talking about genre. This is kind of an interesting question. And again, as with every episode of the How to Be an Author podcast, if you're just writing for yourself, or if you're self-published and you have legions of readers who are rabid fans, you don't need to take this advice to heart. You can just go on with your bad self and do whatever you're doing because it's working. But for those of us who are trying to find ways to save ourselves time as we write our books and create books that are eminently more readable and books that can find more readership, or books that could possibly be conventionally published, then you're going to want to have a listen, because this week's episode is going to be super valuable. If you're not sure about which genre you're writing or thinking about writing, or if you've been writing in a certain genre and wanted to branch out, this episode is going to provide you with so much knowledge and inspiration. Many times writers have an idea of a story and they have this instinctual idea of how they want to write it, what their genre is going to be, especially if they enjoy reading a certain genre, and then this naturally has an effect on their writing. But sometimes it's good to be more intentional in choosing a genre. So in this episode of the How to Be an Author podcast, we're going to be talking about genre, what it is, why it's important, what some of the important genres are for you to know, if you can deviate from genre, how genre impacts your writing. And also we're going to be talking about some of the new subgenres out there that could just inspire you to branch out in some interesting ways. If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Corinna Akavane, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation. Thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode. So let's start talking about what is genre. Genre is the organization of a piece of written work, a piece of literature, into specific categories. And these categories are based on kind of the content, the form, the style. But an important thing to think about is that genre is also more about the aesthetic. You've probably thought about your book's aesthetic, and if you haven't, I really encourage you to go on to TikTok or Instagram and see what authors are talking about when they're talking about their book's aesthetic. The aesthetic being the look and feel of the world of your book. So genres do kind of enter into this aesthetic idea a little bit more than the structure or the ideas, but it does impact the content of your book. So if you know your book's aesthetic, that's definitely going to help you to pin down the genre, but you are going to need to know and realize some more things and then figure out how knowing your genre is going to impact how you're writing your story. So as an author, the genre is definitely controlling what you write and how you write it. It's going to impact that style, it's going to impact the focus of your novel, and it basically kind of gives you a little bit of a blueprint for your story, but don't think of it as so super rigid. Again, this is just a framework, and there is some kind of way of deviating, but we're going to be talking about why you have to really know what you're doing before you do that. So why is genre important? It's important because being able to organize different books into these categories based on their style, their content, all of that really helps publishers, for example, to know whether they want to take on your book. Agents as well have their preferred genres. Booksellers like to organize books by genre so that readers can find them. And that to me is really the most important thing. How can your reader figure out whether your book is something that they want to read or not. How are they going to find your book? Especially on a crowded platform such as Amazon, it's great to have somebody have an idea of what they're dealing with, or to be able to search your book by something other than just your name. So that's really important. It also has your reader knowing what to expect in the sense of, okay, is this factual or not? How dark is it going to be? How much smut's going to be in there? What's the age group this is really intended for? All of those things are dictated a little bit by genre. They definitely fulfill those reader expectations. So that's the important thing, is that you have to know that readers buy certain types of books because they know that they've enjoyed similar books in the past. And often, like, you'll be on Amazon or on Apple Books, and they'll be recommending books based on what you like to read. Well, part of how those books get categorized is definitely by genre. And then you start to read more and more books in this genre, and you get more and more invested because you feel like you kind of belong in this group of people who enjoy this genre. It's kind of familiar ground in a way. And then also in many genres, there are these fandoms, or there's this camaraderie between the various readers who like to read these genres. And some of them are really even obsessed with certain genres. And I think that that's really, really fun. So as I was saying, many authors might feel that the idea of being shoved into a certain genre is a little bit difficult because their book is more than that and they don't like to be categorized. Sure, that's true. Genre is not great for describing the essence of your book. And also, when you're trying to write to genre, like writing within a genre, using those genre parameters to kind of dictate what you're going to write, can that stifle your creativity a little bit? Of course. That can make your muse run away. And this is why I really say that genre is for your readers, for them to find your book, for them to categorize your book. So it's kind of a clumsy, overly generalizing tool for sure. And that's also why I'm glad that there are subgenres that you can work with. But let's just say that for now, it's kind of a good place for you to start. And it's something that you definitely need to know about. And I think that the writer who is savvy about genre can definitely use this knowledge to their advantage, because it really helps you to model your story on something that you know will be successful. Genres are often trend-driven, and so they're always evolving, and often writers do push the boundaries of the genres, so then you're branching out into these new genres. But readers are the ones who ultimately are deciding whether this experimental approach actually works. So there's a proof of concept involved. You as a writer can choose, of course, to say, well, I'm going to write a veterinarian, dark academia romance set in, 15th century France. I'm just putting in a bunch of different details so they can kind of create this whole new subgenre. But if readers aren't clamoring to read that genre, then maybe that subgenre doesn't really stand. You can still write it, of course, but it's up to you, knowing that, okay, this isn't going to be something that I can tell my agent, oh yeah, this is dark academia, veterinary, historical fiction, and that your agent's going to go, oh my God, that's my favorite genre. I absolutely want to represent you. That probably is not going to happen. So if you are a writer who's planning on experimenting with these genres, just remember, if you're self-publishing, yes, anything goes. But if you want your book to be found, you're going to want to think of how to make your book fit into a category in some way. And if you get the genre wrong and you're telling your reader, hey, this is a romance novel, and then they read it and they're like, this is totally not romance, you're going to be getting those negative reviews. So that's really important. Also, if you're publishing conventionally and you try to put in your query letter that, oh yeah, my book belongs to like 10 different genres, it can't be defined as a genre, but trust me, you'll love it, your agent is not going to love that, actually. They're going to think that if it's hard to classify your book, it's going to be hard for them to sell your book to a publisher. And after all, that is the only thing the agents really care about. I mean, your book can be awesome and everything, but if they can't sell it, they're not taking you on. So definitely keep that in mind. Do not shoot yourself in the foot. So knowing that there are certain genre conventions, knowing that there's certain general rules to follow, which touch things such as how long your book is, or what types of characters we're going to encounter, or what kind of settings your action happens in, what kind of themes we're going to be exploring, which kind of point of view we are going to see in this book, and kind of generally where the plot's going to go. So keep in mind that certain things suit specific genres. Keep in mind that you need to know what different genres mean and their pros and cons so that you can decide in complete knowledge of everything which genre you want to write. So I would say that in general, when you're trying to figure out which genre you want to write, first of all, read all different genres, see what you really love, see what you think would be fun to try out, and definitely write that. Writing what you love is the kind of advice that will never really steer you wrong as long as you do it intelligently, you do it to the best of your ability, you do it in a way that you can imagine a reader enjoying. The second thing that you can do to decide which genre you should be writing is write what you're good at. Many of us start writing if we're free writing, and people will say, oh, your writing feels like this or sounds like that. And that's kind of interesting. That's kind of your natural inclination to write in a certain genre or style. And I would say if you don't want to fight that, good for you. It's probably going to make it a little bit easier for you to get your book written. I hear so many authors say, oh yeah, I'm writing a romance novel because that's what sells. Okay, fair enough. Romance novels do sell, but is that really something that you're going to enjoy, that you're going to be good at? Is it going to ring kind of false or contrived? Is your reader going to be able to tell that you really wrote this with money in mind? Are you going to get burnt out and frustrated because this is not what's in your heart? Maybe. So be really careful when you think you're writing to market or writing to genre. That's not normally something I would suggest you do. However, if you're like, I've been writing this genre forever and I just saw that this other genre is doing really, really great and I was hoping to explore it and I think it would be really fun and I like it for XYZ real tangible reason, then by all means, experiment and see where it goes. I think an important thing as well is think about your audience. Think about their expectations. It's not just about you as the writer. You're writing for an audience of readers. So when you're writing a specific genre, think about how you're going to deliver on the promise of that genre. So if you're subverting your genre completely, think that your reader is going to have that frustration. And of course, test genres, play with it, do some writing prompts, experiment. I think that there's no time wasted when you're writing. So many people are like, oh, I'm not going to start writing in this genre because if it doesn't work out, I'll have wasted time. No, you won't have. You are honing your craft, and that's really crucial in the whole writer's life thing is playing, experimenting, having fun. You never know when you're going to find your next favorite genre that might be working out for you even better than what you were writing in before, or work out better than what you thought you were going to be writing in. So that's another thing. Don't be disappointed if you were thinking, oh, I want to be writing historical fiction. That's what real literature is to me. And then you find out that you're actually better at writing mystery. There's nothing wrong with that. So don't think in terms of a hierarchy of genres either. I truly believe that all genres are equal. So don't think to yourself, wow, I set out to write historical fiction or literary fiction, and these are the only real types of fiction. And now I've found myself writing a thriller, or I found myself writing something that's more like fan fiction. I've completely failed. That's not true. You've just found the thing that you enjoy writing right now. And to me, that is a huge success. So definitely play around and see, because I think that the person who is successful at writing in any genre is really doing exactly what they're meant to be doing. So now let's talk about some of the more popular genres in fiction, because I want to help define these so that you don't get confused along the way. And also, as you listen to these descriptions of genres, maybe it's going to give you ideas for stories, or it's going to give you ideas for new ways of exploring your plot or your characters. It's going to give you ideas for where you can go next. And I think it's so full of possibilities when you look at all these different things. So let's talk about these popular genres. And then after that, we're going to be talking about subgenres. And along the way, we're going to be hitting on some of the conventions of these books. And I'll be telling you what to look out for when you're writing these types of books in these specific genres. So this is going to be really educational for you. Let's start with romance. I think this is a fun one. As you know, romance is a super successful genre. People love it. Romance is essentially a story about a romantic relationship, sometimes between two people, maybe more, but there's definitely that romantic idea. So there's a lot of tension in these books, and often your traditional romance books tend to be a little bit idealized. There's a description of desire, and then there's going to be that tension that's created by the fact that one of the conventions of this genre is that authors of romance keep the two main characters apart, or at least not having the relationship they wish for much of the novel, but they do eventually end up together. So that's one of the important things to know with romance, is that usually it is a happy ending. In fact, I say usually, I would say that almost always readers do expect that happy ending, the happy ending being that the characters are ending up together. And there are also many tropes in romance that you're going to be wanting to look at if you're thinking of writing romance. And there are also these different characteristics of romance, which is, for example, one of them being that their protagonist and antagonist is not the normal thing. The antagonist is one of the characters that are going to be in this love relationship, not because they're bad, but because they're being kept apart. So it's a completely different structure than most other novels. But there's subgenres to this as well. So you can have paranormal romance. You can have historical romance. You can have different types of categories of romance. You can have fantasy romance, gothic romance, contemporary romance, urban romance, young adult romance. And you can imagine what all of these different subgenres are going to entail. But I'll be talking a little bit more about defining subgenres in just a little bit. Now, the next genre I wanted to talk about is science fiction. Science fiction, many of you love to write, and this incorporates any type of story set in not necessarily the future. It could be the past. It could be another dimension. It could be, another world altogether. But the thing that kind of puts all science fiction books in the same category is that they feature some kind of scientific, technologically driven concept. So writers are probably going to be doing a lot of research when they are doing these books. They're going to be building new worlds, and they're going to be coming up with a whole vocabulary and setting that really helps with the plot. And again, in science fiction, there are a ton of different subgenres and tropes, just like there are in romance, and there are these expectations that your readers are going to have. Next is action and adventure. So a lot of people wonder about the differences between things like mystery and thriller and action adventure. I sometimes feel like action adventure can be thriller. It's any story that puts the protagonist in this very real physical danger. So it means that this is the type of book where you're going to have these thrills and chills and spills, these near misses, lots of very physical, daring feats, all of that. It's pretty fast paced. And there's usually a really big deadline, like a ticking clock in these types of books. There's a lot of tension. And then there's this climax where the reader's like, oh, okay, there's going to be probably a happy ending where the character gets this thing that they've been going for. And think about in adventure, often you're going to have these really unique settings that enable the sort of action and risk-taking that is one of the hallmarks of this genre. Now let's talk fantasy. Fantasy is different from sci-fi in that often fantasy is going to deal more with kingdoms as opposed to sci-fi, where you're usually talking about different universes, right? So there's a little bit of a nuance there. Same thing though as sci-fi, writers are going to be spending a lot of time on world building. And in fantasy, there's often a big mythical component as well as a lot of magic, whereas sci-fi, you're going to have more science. Often a lot of the fantasy books are going to have these settings that might be historical. There are a lot of them that feel like they're a little bit medieval. But there are also a lot of subgenres involved here. And again, the tropes that you're going to need to know. So if you're planning on writing a fantasy book, look at, okay, what kind of world should I base it in? And how does this help my plot? What kind of plots are expected? Oftentimes there's going to be a quest or there's going to be some kind of a power struggle, the struggle to rule whatever the kingdom or the world of your fantasy book is. And often you're going to have these mythical creatures such as dragons or fairies or elves or what have you. So take a look at that if that sounds like a fun thing for you. When I was first starting out, I would always see a term when I looked at what agents were looking for. And this term is speculative fiction. And I was like, wait, speculative fiction? What does that mean? And I was thinking that, that people are wondering, I wonder what this is. That's not exactly right, but it's kind of right. The speculative fiction is actually a story that's created in a world that's kind of different than our world. And it can overlap a little bit with things like science fiction and fantasy and horror and supernatural. It can also be dystopian. It could be apocalyptic. It can have even alternative history. So there's a bunch of books that are, kind of like, what if this had happened instead of that in history? Or what if this were to take place? That's the sort of thing that speculative fiction addresses. And this, of course, again, is going to involve a whole lot of world building. The good news with this, though, is that unlike historical fiction, which we'll be talking about in a little bit, you don't have to necessarily be 100% historically accurate, but sometimes there are some requirements to make it at least plausible, to make this new version of the world logically plausible. So think about that. Now we've got suspense and or thriller. So this is definitely something that's similar to action and adventure, but you really have a character who's in danger. This is crucial. It really is all about pursuit and escape. So you've got these very present bad guys. You're going to have, these bad guys that the character needs to escape from or fight against or, win against. There are going to be a huge number of threats against the protagonist. So really, really high stakes. And it can be physical threats, psychological threats, which is really important. Lots of cliffhangers here, but the setting being really integral to the plot, and it's really, really kind of exciting to read. And again, you're often going to have some kind of a time that the character needs to do something by. And often the stakes in these kind of books can be really huge, not just personal to your character, but it can be, and now your character needs to save the world. That sort of story is going to be a suspense or thriller book. Now the next genres are young adult and new adult. These are similar, and I don't even really see these as a complete genre because I feel like they overlap into a ton of different genres. It's just that they're marketed to adolescents, young adults, maybe even college students. And so the young adult being younger than the new adult, but I feel like these are pretty similar. And adults also like to read these books, and often they're like coming of age stories, but there are often elements of fantasy and science fiction and supernatural stuff. And there's a lot of uncertainty in the fact that it is a lot of coming of age. So in these books, I would say in general, the thing that does kind of make them a genre is who your audience is, and also the fact that the characters are going through a lot of growth and questioning as they go. And often there's a lot of diversity in these books, which is really, really nice. So they're super popular, especially right now. I would say that in new adult also, since it is a lot about like leaving home and living independently, these books tend to be less fantasy or paranormal oriented and more real life oriented. And there's going to be some degree of maybe romance and erotica as well, mixed in with that, because that's a big part of that independent living situation. So that would be also the big difference between young adult and new adult. So let's say that you have a book that focuses on a young protagonist and you're not sure whether it's new adult or young adult. Look at whether it's set in a more fantasy setting or if it's set in a more urban or realistic setting. That's going to be one of your tips. And also look if it's some kind of a leaving home thing. Look at how much romance or erotica there is in it, and that'll tell you which one of those two genres you're actually doing. Now, another genre that we have is the whole horror genre, paranormal stuff, ghost books. Obviously, these are scary stories. Usually the protagonist is going to be overcoming these supernatural beings, the supernatural beings being the antagonist. There's also kind of a little subgenre that's occult, and this is more of the satanic or devil-like antagonist. And again, there are going to be a lot of tropes in this genre. Stephen King was one of the big writers in this genre, H.P. Lovecraft. So you're going to want to go back and read things by the masters of the genre and see how you're going to stick to it and see how you're going to depart from it. The thing with horror stories is that they definitely don't need a happy ending necessarily at all. So if you're somebody who thinks that happy endings are for suckers, you might want to consider horror. Now we've got the mystery and the crime genre. This is where there's a question that has to be answered, a crime that has to be solved. Or sometimes, there's this mystery of like this, who is this person or what's the identity? So these novels have clues, there's rising tension, and there are a ton of different subgenres in this category, but you're usually going to have a main character who's solving the crime, whether as a professional or as an amateur sleuth. You've got police procedurals that seem to be kind of an offshoot of this, but of course, we're dealing with a character who's a police officer or a detective, so they probably have access to more technological or forensic tools that they can use. They're going to be collecting evidence in a different way. There might be a medical examiner type of thing. All of that is going to be another genre that ties into the crime genre. I talked about historical a few times in this podcast. History and historical books are a huge genre. They take place in a factual historical backdrop. So that's really important. You're showing characters who are probably fictional, but you're showing them in a backdrop that's going to be as real as possible. So you do need to do your research, and you can depart from what actually happened in terms of events, but you really want your backdrop to be as accurate as possible, because readers of historical fiction often expect that. They expect to be learning from reading this in addition to being entertained. So I think that's pretty important. And then you've got the subgenres like historical romance, which is going to show this love relationship between two probably fictional characters in a factual historical setting. Another genre that hasn't been super popular lately, but I think that with subgenres coming up, it's probably gaining in popularity, is the Western. As you can figure out, these books are set in the American West. It's a lot about, camaraderie, survival, maybe romance. It's got some adventure. It could have elements of crime fiction. So you can really add stylistic elements to any storyline to make it Western, which is a great example of how genres are often aesthetic driven. The Western thing is going to include, what people are wearing at the time, lots of people in cowboy hats, saloons, what have you, whatever you're choosing to focus on, but you are going to be looking to research some of those details that can give you a lot of the texture from the American West. And again, it doesn't need to be completely historically accurate, but it can be. There's another genre called the family saga. Often these are going to be a series, and often it's going to be about like an ongoing story of a couple generations in a family or a couple families living in an area. So the plot's going to be things like, what's going on with businesses or romances or like a family curse. So look at things like Bridgerton or The Godfather. These are good examples of these family sagas. And by nature, these can be kind of historical. So you can be researching the setting and deciding, where am I going to set this family story of mine? So that could be interesting. And these stories can span generations so that you start in a long ago time and you end up in a more contemporary setting. So when you're writing these kinds of books, whether it's a single book or it's going to be a series of books, you're going to want to really work on your timeline really, really well because you don't want to lose your reader. Now, another genre is going to be something that they call women's fiction. And I never really agree so much with categorizing something as women's fiction. And people think that women's fiction and chick lit are one and the same. I would say that they're not really. I would say that chick lit is aimed at a certain age group of women, like 20s to 30s. It talks about things that are a little bit more frivolous, like shopping, relationships, fun things like that. Whereas women's fiction can be a pretty serious plot line. It's more about the challenges of being a woman directly. So there can be conflicts with men, but it's not limited to that. It could be workplace stuff. It could be, more political. It could be artistic. Whatever you find that's a challenge for a woman in a storyline, that's going to be women's fiction. So often, if you've written a book where an agent would say, well, you've got this very strong female protagonist, look at it and ask yourself, is it women's fiction or is it something else that happens to have a female protagonist? Because I feel that women's fiction kind of pegs your book as a specific thing that maybe it's not necessarily just that, only because it has a female character. You've got magical realism now, which, magical events are kind of part of everyday life. So they're not all over the place. They're not seen as abnormal or unusual. They're just kind of woven in to a more naturalistic story as a part of the story that just makes it a little bit more, more fun. It gives it a quaintness. There are a lot of South American authors who do this, and I think that this can be really fun. Recently, we had, in terms of TV, we had Jane the Virgin that touched on this. For example, like telenovelas have a lot of this woven in. 100 Years of Solitude is one that's one of the big classics in this genre, but definitely you can have touches of this. And then you have books where it kind of skews a little bit more gothic. So think about, is it magic realism? Is it gothic? Is it paranormal? It can be any of those things, but the magical or paranormal or gothic elements aren't completely heavy in the storyline. And finally, we have literary fiction. This is the thing that some authors say they want to write. This is the thing that is going to be winning the prizes, the literary competitions, because it might not be as fun to read sometimes because it's focusing on psychology, on emotion, on the human condition. It's all about inner life. So oftentimes these books are not going to have this rollicking, fun time, adventurous plot where people are running from here to there. It's going to be more about a person sitting around kind of asking themselves questions about, what it means to be them. So honestly, literary fiction is not as popular as a lot of the genres, but it's got this large number of prizes that it wins just because, some readers are going to say that this is literature. And so it keeps being popular with the critics, but not as popular with the readers. But it's fine. If you want to write literary fiction, try to find a way of writing fun literary fiction. And I think that that could bring you quite a bit of success. So now let's talk about some of these subgenres I mentioned earlier in the podcast. So you might be thinking, okay, wait a second. What makes a subgenre different from just a trope or a trend or just a flavor that you're giving your book? So I would say that subgenres happen when you have like a lot of readers wanting this kind of book. So they become popular for these really specific elements. That's when eventually a trope becomes a subgenre, or that's when a certain type of setting leads to a subgenre. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And these are always evolving. So you're going to have some subgenres that are going to be kind of waning and wafting in and out of popularity. But it's good for you to know that they exist. So some of the subgenres that we can think of are dark. For example, you can have a dark romance. You can have a dark mystery. And these things are, as you guessed it, kind of dark, right? They're not as cheerful. They've got kind of grim imagery to them. You can have dark academia, for example. So it's things that have a little bit of a gothic element, a little bit of an emo element, something that's a little bit less cheerful than it could be. You also have contemporary. Contemporary puts a spin on any kind of book where you have these more true to life settings, more modern characters. You have the differentiation between high and low. This is kind of like the highbrow, the lowbrow. You can have things be more or less sophisticated. That's an interesting subgenre. You also have a subgenre which is urban. You can guess what that is. That's going to be anything that takes place in a more urban environment with characters who are impacted by their urban surroundings. This can be inner city, or it can be, uptown is often a little bit more gritty. And there are often these preoccupations with things that people who live in these urban settings care about. There's also coming of age. Coming of age, as I was mentioning before, in the young adult fiction, coming of age is kind of expected, but you can have coming of age novels that are more romantic. You can have coming of age novels that are historical. You can have a mystery that has coming of age elements. I had talked about the women's fiction. You've got the chick lit, which can often be a mystery that's chick lit, or you can have an adventure that's chick lit, and that can be kind of fun, but often it's geared towards single working women, just so that you know that. There's cozy. Cozy is usually applied to mysteries that take place in a cute setting, something like a bookstore or a knitting circle or a cute little village in Scandinavia, and that the sleuth is an amateur. You also have a subgenre of dystopian. That's kind of interesting. You can guess what dystopian is, obviously. You could also have a subgenre that's Christian. And that's kind of interesting, where often that'll impact your writing because the hero and the heroine are usually devout Christians. There's usually not so much sex involved, especially not before marriage. And then you've got another genre, which is glitz and glamour. This focuses on kind of the jet-setty, crazy rich Asians, elite, celebrity-like characters. And then you've got the gothic subgenre, which talks about decay and ruin. One of the enjoyable Gothic books I saw recently was Mexican Gothic, which was a great example of this. And then you've got psychological, which I think is an aspect of many books, but some books really have things that are really more based on the disturbances in the human psyche. So they're going to be these altered realities, and you can insert these into many different kinds of books. And that's what makes it a subgenre. It's kind of that you are taking your basic genre and then you're giving it a twist. That's how I would define the sub part of the subgenre. Now, I've come across a few interesting new subgenres that are gaining in popularity. So if you want to kind of be at the forefront of a subgenre that's starting to do really well, you might want to hear about these new subgenres that I have noticed around the Bookiverse. One of them is postpartum horror. That's right. It straddles that fine line between horror and thriller, and it's all about mothers who've just given birth and they're sleep deprived and, they've had a hard time of it. And now there's this kind of grim thing that's happening, something really scary. I think Rosemary's Baby was maybe the beginning of that, but there are other books that are really, really good that are coming out these days that are all about that kind of potentially horrific time after you've given birth. Similarly, there's a subgenre called bad mothers. There are a lot of mothers who feel ambivalent, and so they kind of identify with these protagonists who know they have these family responsibilities, but who are trying to escape them. Mothers are feeling unfulfilled, so they're abandoning their kids and families while they kind of discover themselves. And oftentimes the mother's not really a bad mother, but she's probably feeling pretty torn about this. There's another subgenre that's really getting more and more popular these days, and I'm not surprised. It's called cli-fi. You probably can guess it's shorthand for climate fiction. It's really relevant right now, unfortunately, and it does incorporate climate science into a book. So you can use the basis of global warming or dirty air or other type of pollution or, big pharma, whatever, and you can create a dystopian future or present out of these things and then set your book in that. There's also a fun subgenre, which I like, and actually my book, Written in Stone, is a little bit like this. It's a metatextual mystery. So this is basically a bookworm sleuth who's going to figure out, a puzzle or a mystery, and the clues are hidden in a book. So that's really interesting. So there's a story within the story often. It's very bookish, and it's wonderful for people who love to read. Another subgenre that's really becoming more popular these days is the cozy mystery. So it's like a cozy mystery, except it's a cozy because the sleuth is queer. So this adds the kind of fun queer part with the fun cozy mystery part. And so it's going to be fun for people who want to look at that whole thing of the cozy mystery, but have it be a little bit more contemporary. Finally, we have hope punk, which is unlike steampunk or unlike the whole grim style that's kind of dark and depressing. Hope punk is more that sort of aesthetic, but the idea is that the good is worth fighting for. So that's kind of interesting. So any kind of genre can have this hope punk twist on it. And this is supposedly a type of speculative fiction where the reality of the book is not our reality that you know right now. So I think that these are all really fun genres that you might want to try to explore. But again, when you're going to be writing your query letters or when you're going to be trying to write your blurb for your book, you're definitely going to want to let people know what your genre is. So when you're rereading your book, ask yourself, does my book actually belong to this type of genre, or am I going to disappoint the reader who's looking for this sort of genre? What are the characteristics of my book that do make it fit in this genre? And if you're torn, you're going to have to pick one. And if it looks like some of the elements in your book really, really don't fit, you might want to consider changing some of those elements if you're concerned with the sales and with defining what your book is or with finding an agent. But many times an agent will say, you know what, we're going to tweak what you're saying this genre is, or an editor is going to come along and say, I feel like this convention can't be ignored. Let's try to put this in. So you'll be able to tweak your book in a way that you can live with, but in a way that makes your genre more obvious. If you have any pressing writing-related questions or would like to be featured on the How to Be an Author podcast, please feel free to reach out on my website, creativeandwritingcoach.com.